This is the Nostalgic Future Podcast, where the past is the only way forward.
We're two guys in our 40s watching the world pass us by, and we know the only way we'll ever be relevant again is to somehow convince everyone to be as passionate as we are about our pop culture obsessions.
We're your hosts, Joe Cook and Chris Marchand, and today is our origin story episode.
So, Joe, here we are. We are starting a podcast. Now, it's called Nostalgic Future, and that means if we're doing a first episode, we have to explain ourselves. What is this podcast about? Where did it even come from? How would you describe it? This is an origin story episode. What would you say? What would be your answer?
All right, Chris. So the first thing first, I would just say that this podcast, well, it sort of evolved the concept of this podcast because you and I, we've been friends for a long time now,
7 years.
Yeah. 6, 7. I was thinking 6, 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we met in 2016 and we were friends on social media for a couple years before that. And we've had a lot of ideas for podcasts over the years. And so, we had this idea for a Quantum Leap podcast that, we've talked about for a long time. We've had an idea for Beatles podcasts. You and I both have this kind of evangelical Christian pop culture, subculture thing that we grew up as a part of. We've talked about ideas for that, all these different things. And then we kind of came to the point where we realized we couldn't settle on one. And so this is sort of this big ball of pop culture and nostalgia, everything rolled into one. And it's I think it is a great excuse to talk about everything we've ever wanted to talk about. How's
that sounds good. And as you were talking, that reminded me of our first mutual love, which is a Christian music artist. We don't mean to alienate our audience right from the beginning, but our initial love was the artist named Rich Mullins, and he was famous for having this hit song in the late 80s, early 90s called Awesome God, and it blew up everywhere. In fact, it was even sung in like some kind of Netflix teen musical, rom-com movie. Did you know about that one, Joe?
Yeah, it was in that. And what was the show on HBO it was just in?
The Righteous Gemstones.
Righteous Gemstones. It was in the first. It was in the first episode, and like the very first scene of the series is I think like a Chinese version of Awesome God.
Yeah, because they're doing this mass baptism in a wave pool in Asia or China or somewhere. And so guess what? We're not alienating our audience. In fact, if you paid attention, a Christian music song has made its way across the world in various levels, and that's actually true. What I wanted to say about that was we've had numerous talks about this artist, Rich Mullins, and maybe some people are here listening today because they've heard our own podcast. But in the midst of it, you started to mention, Joe, I don't know, I can't remember when it was or how it was, but it was kind of like, well, I kind of love Billy Joel. I really love Billy Joel. And we started talking about Billy Joel, and in the midst of it, like, I think if we were to have like a battle of who likes Billy Joel more, I think you would win. But Billy Joel is like hugely significant in my own life. To me, Billy Joel represents my older brother introducing me to his music. And he took the volumes 1 and 2 of his greatest hits and dubbed it onto a tape for me. And I carried that tape around with me for years. It's like, this is my Billy Joel greatest hits. And
Billy Joel's Greatest Hits Volume 1 and 2 is the first CD I ever purchased.
There you go. The first non-Christian album I ever purchased was Billy Joel's River of Dreams. And that was a big step for me. I felt like I was wading into Satanism, but I don't, I mean, there was a Christian song on that album, right? A semi-Christian song. So anyway, I think I was okay. I think I made it. I made it through.
Well, he sang about how he wasn't sure if there was life after this, and that just shattered your young faith. It was
when my mom heard that, she was like, "This isn't Christian."
Let me ask you this: was there ever an album that you owned growing up that your mom was upset about? I do have one.
No, not really. I didn't really push the limits that much. What was yours?
Tom Petty, Wildflowers, because he sang about rolling a joint in You Don't Know How It Feels. And like I was playing that song, and it genuinely upset her, but she did not make me get rid of the album.
There you go. There you go. So all of which is to say that you mentioning Billy Joel set us off of like, oh, you like this? Yeah, I like this. Oh, well, okay. And then we ended up talking about all these other things other than this initial artist, Rich Mullins.
Yeah, in fact, the funny thing is we actually talked about when we initially started, and I guess we should mention, we do have another podcast called Between the Songs, and it primarily focuses on this artist, Rich Mullins. But when we initially came up with the idea for that podcast, we envisioned doing a season on Rich Mullins and then doing multiple seasons on different artists. That didn't really happen. But what we had at one point, we had bounced around the idea of doing season 2 on Billy Joel, which is probably a terrible idea in that you've done this relatively obscure Christian artist as your first season, and then you do like one of the biggest, secular pop artists of all time as your second season, and you completely alienate your first season audience. It's probably best that we didn't do that, but we did actually have serious discussions about that.
Because the concept of our Rich Mullins podcast is going through every one of his albums and trying to unpack how the songs are written and the albums recorded and the story behind the album. It's a concept that applies to any artist.
Yeah.
Now, so here's what started to happen. Then we had this idea about talking about Quantum Leap. And we're just going to mention that, and that'll come back later, where we want to go through every single episode of Quantum Leap and discuss it. In the midst of it, by the way, we found out like that somebody else has already begun doing that.
Like several people have done Quantum Leap podcasts.
Quantum Leap episodes.
But who cares?
But okay, in the midst of it, we started to realize we have a problem here. We have too many ideas. We want to do Beatles movies. You want to talk about Cheers. I want to talk about.
I'm wearing a Cheers T-shirt, a worn out Cheers T-shirt as we record this.
That shirt is from 1986. I bet.
This thing, I've had this shirt for like a decade. You can barely read it anymore, but yeah.
We started to realize two things. One is we have too many ideas, but two, all of our ideas are looking backward into the things that have influenced us and shaped us, the things that we're passionate about, they're sitting back there in the past. Everybody loves Cheers, and yet are people in today's generation even going to discover it and will be willing to take the time to re-listen to it? We're 40 years old. Are you 41 yet?
I turn 41 2 days from now. Yeah.
So by the time people listen to this, you're going to be 41.
I will be well into 41 by the time this hits the airwaves, so to speak, because I'm old enough to like think of things in terms of airwaves.
Yeah. So we're sitting in between our parents' generation, where everything they love is going to also go the way of the dinosaur or the way of the buffalo, whatever nomenclature you prefer there. But also, you and I have all these loves that our kids, are they going to discover them? Are they going to take the time to watch through all 200 episodes? Is it 200? How many is it of Cheers?
Cheers is nearly 300 episodes. It was
there
on
you
for
go.
11 seasons.
Yeah. And I think part of this podcast is about you and I rediscovering why we loved the things we grew up with, but also rediscovering things that we've always wanted to find out about.
And it's funny, and I didn't plan on even talking about Cheers, and that, to me, that's going to be a whole other episode that we need to do this year. But it's funny because, in a moment we're going to talk about these almost categories of how we're looking at these episodes that we want to release, because we have multiple categories of how we want to cover these topics. And the word that we kept going back to was passions, that these were passions of ours. And Cheers to me was a passion as a kid. And it's a bizarre thing too. I was 12 years old when Cheers ended. And I had been watching Cheers, for a few years before it ended. I mean, I remember watching the finale live, and I wasn't old enough to get half the jokes on Cheers at that point, but it was like the greatest show in the world to me at 12 years old. And I've been to Boston one time in my life, once in my life. Have you been to Boston, Chris?
No, I've never been. No, I
Okay.
mean, I know enough about it and all the pop culture, you know.
There is so much historically to see if you visit Boston. I went to Cheers twice, and that's pretty much it. Like, it was like Mecca to me. It was like pop culture Mecca to me. To be there in person after having seen that, for my entire life.
Do you use the word pilgrimage? Do you use that word? When I say that, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about Rich Mullins. When I lived on the Navajo reservation for 4 years, and inevitably 2 or 3 times a year, somebody would come through the res making a Rich Mullins pilgrimage. It's what we used to call it, because they wanted to see where he lived and walk in his footsteps.
You are a pilgrimage kind of guy. Now,
yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, you really are. I mean, because every time you mention something, you have lots of stories like that, and they're gonna come out in various ways as we go through these episodes. I'm a little less of a pilgrimage guy. I'm kind of a like hide back in the corner with my arms folded, going, I don't know about all this, or I'm too scared. I met my hero. I met Rich Mullins, and I had no idea what to say. I was just dumbstruck. I was like, can you take a picture? And I took the one star in my mind that I took a picture with was this guy, this artist, but I'm not that kind of person. Like I get fearful, I get afraid. So for me, I'm more of a like just sit in a room quiet and contemplate. And so I want to hear. I love all of your stories. You've always got a story about something, and you've also met some of these people because your career goes back into radio as well. And so sometimes you've met some of these people, like you've met Jerry Stiller. You interviewed him.
Yeah. I interviewed Jerry Stiller in 2008, and I started in radio in 2006. I started working in radio, and I was with an oldie station for probably about 8 years, and then managed a few stations out on the Navajo reservation. And I still do some work for a station, but remotely, like from home, just recording stuff for a station up in Alaska. When I was with that oldie station, it was hands down the most fun I've ever had in a career. And I had made this personal, rule early on in my radio career, where I'd been given the opportunity to interview people that I wasn't, like some people are just great, that they can sit down and they can talk to anybody, and they can take any topic, and they're just so flexible that they can make something entertaining or informative out of it. I learned early on this was a weakness of mine, that I wasn't particularly great with just talking to anybody. And I made this decision early on that I would only interview people that I was genuinely passionate about or that I was interested in. And it didn't matter. And I have a fairly broad, range of interests, but I just kind of made this little personal rule that, like, I don't want to waste their time doing what I think is just this, kind of a subpar interview because I'm not as informed as I want to be, or, like I can feign interest, but to me, it doesn't seem sincere. And some people are great. They can just, even if they're not necessarily sincere about it, they can come across that way. I didn't feel like I was great at that. And so during that several years that I was working at the oldie station, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people that genuinely really interested me. And some of them would be people that you've absolutely heard of. Some of them would be people you've never heard of. But the one kind of thread that I don't think I necessarily looked at the time was that I was diving into all of these influences from my childhood and from my formative years. And I was looking toward the people who shaped me to become who I was. And you and I were both, we're both born in 1981. We're both in that weird kind of era where we're not quite Generation X and we're not quite millennials. We're just sort of like plopped there in the middle.
We're exennials. Exennials, whatever
is
that
it-
means. We're the Goonies generation.
yeah, and exactly.
And I'm the kind of person, maybe I'm just kind of person that I'm skeptical of it all. I'm just like, whatever, label me, fine. I don't really, but it's so funny because maybe that's part of my generation is not wanting to fit in. I just don't care to. Like, it's also
that's
my personality, I guess. I'm just interested in everything. I'm interested in it all,
I'm listening to the audiobook right now, the Chuck Klosterman book. I think I was telling you that he just released a book called The 90s.
Mm.
And it's really interesting because you and I were both kids growing up in the 90s, and this theme that keeps coming up is about how important it was for our generation in the 90s to basically not try too hard. It was uncool to try to be cool, and it was basically uncool to care.
Yeah,
and
that's a big thing.
And I never particularly, it's funny, I never viewed myself as being that way because I was so different than so many of the kids I knew growing up in the 90s. But as he was talking about that in the audiobook, I found myself really relating with that on numerous levels, and almost looking at how different I was as a kid and going, oh, well, that in a way proves I didn't care. Like, we're going to talk about our origin stories in a moment. I want you to start, but part of mine is just about how unrelatable I was to so many in my generation. Yours is a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, let me get into that in a second here. And let me say a couple of things first, which is I feel like, okay, now that we're 40, we've gotten to a place in our lives where we're comfortable with what we like and what we're passionate about. This is a big part of what this podcast is. And it's like, you know what? I'm just going to let everybody know now, this is what I like to talk about. Joe, you and I could spend the rest of our lives just talking about Cheers. And guess what? I'm not even nearly as passionate about Cheers as you are, but I could do it. I like Cheers enough. Cheers is embedded enough in my mind. And so that's what's funny about this podcast is we're not necessarily nerds like in the same way that people that, cosplay and they'll dress up. But man, we will talk endlessly about some of these musicians and movies and TV shows and all of that, those kinds of things, which leads me to this next point,
which is probably the OCD.
We're OCD a little bit.
I think probably it's probably, but hey, whatever works.
Okay. So I want to admit up front, if anybody's listening to this in years to come, please reference this origin story episode, because guess what? We are not possibly going to get to everything that has ever existed. Actually, Joe, you cut right to the point. We're going to talk about the things we know about and love. And we're not here to please everybody and to get to everybody's pop culture obsessions. Instead, we're recounting our own. And we have two desires in that. One is, hey, if you haven't watched Cheers, you haven't listened to Billy Joel, one of my big passions is British comedies. If you haven't gotten into British comedies, you might as well start. But the other aspect of it is, man, rediscover your own passions. There might be aspects of your life that you haven't gone back to, you haven't revisited in years. Maybe we'll inspire you to listen or to go back and maybe share it with your family or your kids. That's number two. Finally, point number three, before I get to my origin story, goes back to that word pilgrimage. So every episode is its own little pilgrimage to a subject, to a work that we look back on and we're like, oh, let's talk about it. So we're not going to make the physical pilgrimage, or maybe we will someday. Who knows? I would like to go to Cheers, the bar, pub, whatever it's called.
It was the Bull and Finch pub for years, but it is now Cheers. They've changed the name. They've owned it.
Yeah. They were bought out.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But our episodes, this podcast is a pilgrimage in our memories and in us reaching back to things that we love, and hopefully, and also part somewhat self-deprecatingly, sometimes we're going to wonder, I wonder if this is going to be as good as we remembered it when we were kids. We were talking about that earlier, like,
oh yeah,
G.I. Joe. It's like, well, I don't know that G.I. Joe is any good, even though that's all I watched as a kid, like
yeah,
that kind of thing.
What is, the greatest thing in the world when you're 7 versus the 40, you're going to view it through a totally different lens.
Yeah, that's right. Now, let's get to my story a little bit. In talking about like why we're doing this, you and I discovered that we kind of have these strangely opposite stories of how we began to become obsessed with different works of art, artists, all those kind of things. And I guess here's one of mine. I had these ongoing moments growing up when I would be around an older person. Sometimes they were just middle-aged. Sometimes they were actually elderly. And they would mention something like an old movie star or an old rock band. And they would somewhat like, almost like insultingly being like, well, you're just young. You would have heard of, and then they fill in the blank. And for some reason, it just always irked me. And I kind of like have lived my life in a strange kind of reactionary, resentful anger. Like, I'll show you, I will learn about so-and-so. But part of it also too, like I had this funny moment. I was at my uncle's house. I was probably like 14 years old. I was in his basement. It was like just a family get together. And he had all of these crates of old records. And I was looking through them and hardly anything seemed familiar. And my uncle was like kind of there looking on and you know, like I'm going to make up a band just because it's kind of funny, but I would be looking at and he'd be like, hey, you ever heard that band? Mama Joe's Jam Band? And I'd be like, no, I never. He's like, you haven't heard of Mama Joe's Jam Band? Like, no, I'm 14. Like,
You know, a lot of people would say that their first album was their best, but I would say that Mama Joe's Jam Band's third album was their opus, you know.
yeah. In Mama Joe's Jam Band, they were actually a British band. You know, they wanted to sound like a real blues band, but really they were British. And anyway, that's all part of the whole mythology of that band. Now, when my uncle treated me that way, it caused me to just go like, why? Like, I want to kind of be the opposite when it comes to how I introduce people to works that nobody would have ever have heard of. I want to be really invitational and go, hey, Chris, or hey, Uncle Roger, you should really check out Mama Joe's Jam Band. They're amazing. So instead of like putting this like, why are you so stupid? How come you've never heard of this before kind of mentality onto somebody? I want to have more of an invitational, like, hey, here's this thing that I love. I want you to join me. Would you join me? It's going to be fun. Let's do it together. So I kind of hold those two with me, which is one, I have this resentful way that I was like, I'll show these old people.
You know, this is reminding me of is you've seen the movie The Incredibles, right?
A few times, maybe like 8 or 9 times.
What's the bad guy, the redheaded kid that Mr. Incredible keeps blowing off in the beginning of the movie, becomes the villain?
Yeah, I know.
This is like, it's like you had revenge knowledge. Like,
yeah, exactly. That's the
you know, I'll teach you, Uncle. You know,
yeah.
Then you later in life you return to destroy him with facts.
Right. And that's the thing is I really haven't. I mean, the band that probably he was saying that about was probably like Jethro Tull or something like that, which I still haven't listened to.
No, I haven't either.
But it was, you know, to me as a 14-year-old, I had never even heard of them. So be it, right? But there you go. My hope is like I want people to be as passionate about what we like or to rediscover your own passion. So there you go. There's my origin story. Yours is quite the opposite. And it's also kind of funny.
It is. It's so, mine is, I grew up in New Jersey, South Jersey, about a half hour from Philadelphia. My family, when I was 7 years old, me and my parents moved in with my grandparents. So from the age of 7 to about 14, 15, I lived with my grandparents. You know, there's a lot. I mean, it was me and a bunch of adults. In fact, when we first moved in, my great uncle also lived with us for about a year. So I was in this house with lots of adults, and it was this big Italian family. All of my aunts and uncles and my cousins were over constantly. There were always a lot of people in the house. I was an odd kid, I guess, for the early 90s. My grandparents, you know, they were both born in 1930. I grew up, we had a radio station in South Jersey called WRDR, and it was like it was big band music, Glenn Miller, it was Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Al Martino, all these kind of crooners. I grew up with crooner music in my home constantly, Nat King Cole. And so growing up, I was exposed to a lot of things. My dad got a VCR when I was like 4. It was a Beta. It was Sony Betamax. And so my dad would like just tape tons of movies and TV shows and things that he had loved growing up. So the Honeymooners, Columbo, things like that. So I was exposed to all of this. I wrote a fan letter to Art Carney when I was 17 years old. I have the signed, photo from Art Carney. This is like 1998. Like, I recognize in hindsight, that's peculiar for a kid growing up in the 90s. But at the time, it just seemed like I love the Honeymooners, love Art Carney. So I had a lot of interests in older things just from being around older people constantly. And also not having any siblings, I think. I was an only child. I was really close to some of my cousins who were around a lot. And I had my best friends growing up, but I was always surrounded by adults. And I just took an interest in the things that they were interested in, to the point.
That is weird. That is kind of strange. Like, for instance, I have 4 kids. I feel like granted, I have made them Star Wars fans, but in other ways, like, I feel like I'm always like trying to like convince them, like, oh, you got to listen to this. This is great. And they're always rolling their eyes at me. So that doesn't always happen with kids, right?
That's true. But even Star Wars is so universal. Like, yes, I agree with you, because I did the same thing to my kid. I made him a Star Wars fan, but I would also argue Disney has done everything they can to make our kids Star Wars fans too. But I don't think I'm ever like going to make my kid a Billy Joel fan. But I was a huge Billy Joel fan. Now, that was my thing. My parents, grandparents, they didn't like Billy Joel. I loved Billy Joel. It was, again, kind of weird because I, for some reason, was obsessed with Billy Joel in the early 90s when everybody else I knew was obsessed with Nirvana. And I had no interest in Nirvana because I had Billy Joel and I had the Beatles and I had all of these musical interests that I had. My dad didn't really like the Beatles. I don't know where my love for the Beatles came. I just took an interest in things that were before me.
Now, this is an interesting aspect of it in the sense of some of our differences, but where they actually converge. So I remember first listening to the Beatles on my way to school in the mornings. And they would have these little Beatles segments on the oldies station. And there was 0 Beatles records growing up and not a whole lot of secular non-Christian music. And when the Beatles anthologies came out in the 90s, it was like, that was my chance to finally discover this band. So for me, a lot of it is almost like a man starving for water in a desert. And like, it's like, I have to discover these things, almost like I was discovering ancient scrolls, like unearthed some castle from 2000 years ago. And I was finally able to rediscover the wisdom of the past. And so for me, that hunger has drawn me to like learn more and learn more and learn more and go farther in it.
So I think for me, it is, maybe it's just deconstructing things. I saw a Billy Joel weekend on VH1. It was like probably the late 80s. And it was around the time Stormfront came out. And I, at about 8 years old, seeing that connected with, okay, I like his music. So he was on my like consciousness, from that point on.
Yeah.
I didn't buy an album for a few years.
Yeah.
But I always knew I like Billy Joel.
Yeah, so for me, my first Billy Joel song is "We Didn't Start the Fire." That is my first Billy Joel song because it's the first one that like clicked. I mean, maybe I had heard plenty before that, but it was at that right age. What would that have been? 89?
That was 89. It came out in late 89.
Yeah. So I was right at that age where I was finally starting to realize, oh, there's music, there's pop stars, there's albums, whatever it was. So that's just funny. The Stormfront album is the first one I remember as well, even though I never owned it. Like yeah.
I knew that Billy Joel idolized the Beatles. So I think what happened there was it was almost a natural progression for me. Though I can pinpoint in 1994, the Beatles Live at the BBC album was released. And my mom bought that for me. And it was a really kind of random thing. Like she just heard about this album coming out and probably knew enough of my tastes at that point that she thought Joe would probably like this record. So she bought it for me. It was cassette. It was a double cassette. And that was the first Beatles thing I ever owned. And I loved it. And so I felt like it went from Billy Joel to the Beatles. I became a really, really big Paul McCartney fan through that. I'm probably, as big of a Paul McCartney fan as I am a Beatles fan. And then from Paul, I realized, okay, well, Paul was influenced by Little Richard. He was influenced by Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Buddy Holly, which is another kind of passion of mine. I love Buddy Holly. And for me, I think that, I do have a certain interest in, okay, well, I love this thing, or I love this person or this artist. And there is this desire to sort of understand, what drove them, or what were the things that they loved. And I think there's a lot of things that I've indirectly come to love through people whose work I loved first. So all that to say, I remember, and this, even to me, this is cringy right now. But at the time I was so in my world of, in 1994, I would say that was like ground zero for me as like my Billy Joel fandom. Like it probably never got any bigger than it was for me in 1994.
What else musically could possibly have been going on in 1994? What's more important than Billy Joel in 1994, Joe?
Well, in 1994, Kurt Cobain committed suicide. And it was, as you know, and as everybody of our generation knows, that was like probably the most, like the seminal moment of rock and roll history in our generation. Nothing probably bigger has happened before or since in rock and roll for our generation than Kurt Cobain taking his life. And I remember being around a group of people who were reading, like, it was like People magazine the week that Cobain killed himself.
He was on the cover, right?
He was on the cover. It was the cover story, and literally saying, when you're done with that, can I see that? Because there was an article about Billy Joel's divorce to
Christy Brinkley.
Yeah, his marriage with Christy Brinkley was falling apart right at the time the Cobain thing happened, and I was so oblivious in my own world. I wanted to read the article about Billy Joel in that People magazine.
Yeah, you're like, guys, I know. Okay, but why are you focusing so much on this Kurt Cobain guy? Did you see he's divorcing the Uptown Girl?
Yeah. He's still a downtown guy.
So you might feel the same way. Our listeners, they might feel this way too, where there's these things that they love that kind of take them out of their generation. I think what we're about here is discovering and rediscovering these things that made us kind of a little bit quirky or a little bit out of place within our own time. Now, we're going to get to our categories here right now. But before we do, we want to introduce you to a little section where we're going to call Delusions of Grandeur.
And now it's time for Delusions of Grandeur with O.J. Simpson.
Hey, Twitter world, it's me, yours truly. Well, today's the first day of the NFL Combines, but that's not what the news is today. It's still on the Ukraine. And I noticed that the Donald spoke at CPAC, and I thought we would finally get something, right? Because the Donald loves to give nicknames to people, and they call that Randolph L's guy Dumbo and Kim Little Rocket Man, and even though it would be disrespectful now, but when he first called Joe Biden Sleepy Joe, I got a chuckle out of that. My favorite is still Pocahontas for Elizabeth Warren, even though I think she's a hell of a politician. But I'm a little surprised that he called Putin smart. Well, when you consider that the man makes roughly $140,000 as president, and he has a beach house on the Black Sea that is reportedly worth over $1 billion. I guess smart would be appropriate, but I do think this man is the most hated man in America, and it's time for you, Donald, to give him a nickname. Come on, man. Well, let's just hope that these talks can work out and they end all of this. In any event, hope all is well with you. Hey, take care. God bless.
This has been Delusions of Grandeur with O.J. Simpson, brought to you by the Nostalgic Future Podcast.
So, Joe, we're going to get into the different types of categories. Two main thoughts. One is we have tons of ideas for different types of episodes that we want to discuss, but we've kind of broken down our episodes into three main categories. One, we've already spent a lot of time kind of already talking about it. We got into it like immediately. We couldn't help ourselves. It's our shared passions. We've already talked about Cheers, Billy Joel, and what else? What do we got, Joe? Joe, what do we share together? G.I. Joe, even.
G.I. Joe was a big one. I think did we both watch Mystery Science Theater?
Yeah, I watched it a lot.
By the way, as we tape this episode, tonight is the season premiere of the new season 13. They did a big Kickstarter last year to fund a new season. My son and I supported that, and we're gonna watch the season premiere of Mystery Science Theater tonight.
Joe, that reminds me, every episode we're going to have a little bit of a news segment. How are nostalgia passions in the news? So we might as well do a news segment. In the news. Okay, so needless to say, the great things of our past often seem to be coming back. We'll get to that in some of our future episodes, but I think, it's worth noting. Guess what? If you supported the Kickstarter, you probably already know this, but for people like me that didn't, it's like, a Mystery Science Theater's back again. They've even started their own streaming service, right?
So let me tell you something. I did support the Kickstarter, but I haven't been reading the updates. Yeah. I found out about it because some dude posted on Twitter that he was looking forward to it tomorrow night. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's launching. So I had to figure out how to install. Yeah, they created their own app on I have their Roku app. And they've started the Gizmoplex. It's their own streaming service. And there's 2 events a month that they live stream, including 1 new episode a month. And then there's going to be I think they rotate out 6 older episodes every month, 3 Joel and 3 Mike episodes. Yeah, it's just a fun thing to do. I signed up for a year. I thought it would just be kind of a fun thing, bonding experience with my son. He loves Mystery Science Theater. It's one of these things that I've tried forcing lots of things on him. Mystery Science Theater took. That was the one thing that he loves it every bit as much as I do. We the last live event that we went to before the pandemic started. I haven't been to a concert or anything since the pandemic. Was Mystery Science Theater live. Yeah, so that's going to be one of our shared loves. We'll probably have an episode, assuming we get to all the episodes we want to cover. I can tell you about my story of how Mystery Science Theater plays into my marriage, right? Of course, I think lots of marriages have Mystery Science Theater, beginnings. How it kindled our love for one another, but. I have a story about that. But I'm not sure there are lots of stories like that, but maybe there are.
So romantic. On it's what's it called? What's the ship called? The What of Love?
Oh, the Satellite of Love.
Yeah. See, they're all about love.
There you go. But do you remember where the Mads, the villains? Do you remember what their place was called?
I can't remember.
Were they high? Deep 13.
Deep 13. That sounds very ominous,
isn't it?
The second category, though, is our divergent passions. And so here's what's funny, as we've discussed over and over again what our idea is going to be. I had this one reoccurring moment where I would mention some kind of British show, usually a British comedy or British dramas. I like British mysteries, those types of things. I'd mention it and you'd be like, I've never really seen that. I kind of don't even know what that is. And I'd be like, oh, you don't know it? I got to show you this. I'd be so passionate about it. And so part of this show is going to be us introducing each other to different things. So mine is those British shows that I just can't wait to show you. What's something in that category for you?
For me, I mean, I think certainly you've seen it before, but like Columbo was a big one for me growing up. Like my dad was a huge Columbo fan, and it's one of those things that stuck with me. I absolutely loved it. I think I've seen them all probably multiple times. You know, today we watch it as a family sometimes. My wife loves Columbo, and you know, like, but like, I know that for me, I've been way, more knee deep in it than you have. Or like I mentioned before, Buddy Holly's another one. I doubt you've probably ever listened to a Buddy Holly album from beginning to end.
No.
And like, so I think that would be a great thing to share. Another thing that you always mention, I know you're a big fan. I've never heard a Radiohead album in my life.
Right. And I think Radiohead is an interesting because one is it's not that old and they're still current. At the same time, our sweet spot of nostalgia is the 90s or kind of the mid to late 80s. So for me, Radiohead is just this massive influence on my brain of what I love about music. And there you go. You don't really have any context for that, right?
I have none. Yeah.
And part of me is afraid, he might not like it, right? So I'm going to introduce something to you and you might go, I'm not getting into this. Let
me ask you too, because I'm kind of that way. Do you take it personal when somebody doesn't like something that you love? Because I do take it personal, and I know I shouldn't. It's kind of ridiculous. It's kind of like absurd to expect somebody to love something because I love it.
Yeah.
But it kind of hurts a little when they don't.
Yeah. So yes, I am most naturally disposed to take it personally. I will say this though, at the moment, as a 40-year-old, I'm actually just mad that I can't go back to when you were like 19 and introduce it to you. So now I'm at the place where I'm taking it less personally, but I realize that you've missed the boat. You've missed the train. Like that train has already left the station. You needed to have listened to Radiohead when you were an angry 19-year-old.
This was your Oscar Schindler moment. I could have done so much more.
Yeah, right. Where was I in your life, Joe? Now, for me,
could have given him okay computer.
yes. I could have changed your life, Joe, if you only would have let me. So I take it less personally. It's just like, because I actually had a friend, I tried to get him to listen to Radiohead. And he's just like, again, we're the same age. He's like, I don't get it. I don't know. It doesn't do much for me. And I'm like, no. I tore my clothes, I fell on the ground.
I am pretty open to old new things.
Okay, there you go.
As mentioned, I didn't just have a lack of interest in Nirvana in 1994. I kind of hated Nirvana.
Me too.
Unfairly, but I just was not a fan of that group at all. I didn't like their sound. I didn't like anything about it. It was just unappealing to me. I was in a Walmart a few years back, and I'm digging through like their little $5 CD bin, and I pulled out a copy of Nirvana Unplugged. And it was like for the first time in decades, it was just like, what the heck? I'm going to give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
$5. What's the worst that could happen? I loved it. I fell in love with that record decades after I dismissed it. And I remember I kind of went on social media after it, and I kind of posted an apology to Nirvana that Dave Grohl will never read, but I was wrong.
Yeah.
And so in some ways I think I was a snob about the stuff that I loved and really dismissive. And I think it's taken me years to be a lot more open to things that I otherwise would have just never given a fair shake to.
So this leads to our third category, actually, which is discovering passions. And we could take this in a number of different directions. When we discover a new passion, or we're at least going to attempt it, right? So you can't guarantee that you're going to like my Radiohead, but you're going to at least give it the old college try, right? You're going to make the attempt. Sometimes the passion is going to be from our parents' generation. So for me, my mom has always talked about Ricky Nelson. She's actually, it's a point of pride for her. She's just like, I never liked Elvis Presley because he was a bad boy, but that Ricky Nelson was a good boy. And he was always moral. I was like, okay, whatever, mom, but one of my goals is, you know what? I really need to listen to Ricky Nelson and see, like, do I like this person that shaped who my mom is? So I want to do that.
For me, I bought a Ricky Nelson album when I was like 18. I was 18. I'll tell you what, because Linda McCartney's favorite song was Lonesome Town. And Paul covered it on his Run Devil Run album as kind of a tribute to Linda. He did her favorite song. Aww. And so I then had to go out and buy the Ricky Nelson version. So that's my kind of always just trying to understand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So whether we're trying to understand when we're teenagers, or we're still trying to uncover things when we're in our 40s, that's what we're going to do. Sometimes it's with our parents' generation. Sometimes it's something like Nirvana, where I didn't like Nirvana either. I've heard some Nirvana songs recently, and I'm like, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I like that. So it's rediscovering new passions of things that we missed out on when they were first introduced. And then finally, we have children, not together, but
boom.
Yeah, a little joke there. And, you know, being around kids, being around younger generations, they have their own passions. There's things that they love that they aren't exactly ours, but I can really appreciate it. Like my kids, it kind of breaks my heart. Like, they don't listen to albums. They don't sit there and go, what's the newest whatever album? But they love video game music. And it's like almost always this synth music, kind of synth dance music. And I like that stuff. Like, when the music that they listen to, I don't have any real complaints about it. It's not mine, but I'm like going, all right, well, if that's what they like, that's cool. I can be on board with that.
That is exactly what my son listens to the majority of the time. In fact, he listens to video game music, like versions of popular songs. So like, he'll be playing it. I'll be like, you know, that's Green Day. And then he doesn't even actually know. And he'll like look to see what he's listening to. He goes, yeah, it is. Like, and it's like, I'll recognize the melody of a song, and it's like, but it's been programmed to sound like it's a, you know, an 8-bit or 16-bit video game. And he's really into like that kind of stuff. He is a huge fan of SpongeBob SquarePants production music, the music that they use, you know, as background music during SpongeBob episodes.
He has his own podcast.
He does. He has
what's it called?
It's called SpongeBob Music Minute, and every day on YouTube there's like a minute-long little podcasting he puts out dissecting a track of SpongeBob production music, and it's great. He does a great job at it. It's interesting. Yeah. It's actually made me interested in it. Yeah. So, you know, sometime I think for somebody our age, sometimes certain things come. Yeah, I think because you and I both generally have like a love of music, you know, it's not so hard to be open to those kind of things, to new things. Some stuff it's a little harder than others to get into. But I think it's the idea of, you know, it's trial and error, you know, and just giving things a fair shake.
I think one aspect or one stereotype of growing older is being increasingly closed off to new things. And I think this last category of some of our episodes is about us being open, being willing to embrace something new. And even if it isn't our love, like even if it's like, it's the younger generation, it's our kids, that we at least go, you know what, the kids are all right. It's cool. I appreciate what their passions are going to be.
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course, that also entails looking back at things from previous generations, like you were talking about your mom with Ricky Nelson. For me, my mom was a big fan of country music, especially when I was really younger in the 80s. So we have like, Tammy Wynette albums and Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, and so I don't think I've necessarily been dismissive of that as much as I just have never really given it a real fair listen. A lot of it.
Yeah. Hey, you know what?
I did produce a country music show though for a couple years, so that did expand my my knowledge of the genre a bit. It was a classic country show.
Well, so we haven't even talked about this idea yet, but maybe we can just brainstorm on each episode because I have a whole part of my own history is country music, and me growing up hating it, thinking it was stupid. And then something clicked in my mid 30s. I don't know. I heard a Dolly Parton song and I'm like, what? Like, oh, that lady can write and sing and play. And so the last 5 years has been a little bit of me rediscovering that. I mean, I now own 5 Dolly Parton albums on vinyl that I previously had none. But of course, there's way more to rediscover. Like, I mean, I have a Willie Nelson. There's Tammy Wynette. There's, Glenn Campbell. There's all those guys, So
Yeah.
maybe I'll get there eventually.
I went and saw Glenn Campbell on his farewell tour. I did love Glenn Campbell growing up. That was one artist
Yes.
I did like, but he was the Taylor Swift of his time. He was never really country.
That's right. Now, we're going to get into what our first proper episode is going to be about. But before we do, we want to introduce you to another segment, ongoing segment that we're going to have on this podcast. It's what we call the rabbit hole. Now, the rabbit hole is about what Joe or I, either together, separate, have been obsessed with over the last couple of weeks. We want to share it with you. It could run the gamut between something we just, we took an old book off our shelves. We're like, yeah, I'm finally reading this book. Or it's something that we've gotten ourselves caught up with that we can't stop obsessing over it. We're like, and then we find ourselves down the rabbit hole. 2 days later, a week later, we're still on this one topic.
And sometimes the rabbit hole will be something like I spent about 2 years on a Norm Macdonald rabbit hole.
2 years.
and that.
Do you know Rip Van Winkle, like the guy that wakes up after like 6 years or whatever? You're like I spent 2 years on Norm Macdonald.
and so there are certain things, but I've always loved Norm Macdonald. So, but like we didn't have YouTube, in the 90s. So there's so much to discover that I didn't know was there. And I basically spent the entire pandemic watching Norm videos on YouTube. This week's rabbit hole is a little different. This is something I never knew existed. Now, apparently you were somewhat familiar with this, but I had no idea until I stumbled upon this.
I heard about this a couple of years ago, and then I forgot about it. Somebody, I don't know who it was, shared this with me, but it has to do with a restaurant that I grew up going to almost every week until they all started to close.
Of course, we're talking about Rax
roast beef restaurants. And they were dotted all about the Midwest. Joe, you've shared that you're from New Jersey. I should share. I'm from the heart of Illinois.
I was born in Ohio, so we were like neighbors for.
So you are a good Midwestern boy.
Well, we weren't exactly neighbors. We had Indiana in the middle, but
Right. So Ohio had Rax, and they still do.
Ohio had Rax. Honestly, we may have even had Rax on the East Coast growing up. There were like 500 of them at one point.
They're all over. Rax
were
was essentially an equivalent of Arby's, and there's probably like 5 of them still around.
Yeah, and I do remember Rax growing up. Like I definitely remember seeing Rax. I think we probably ate at them too, because I think there were some in truck stops in Pennsylvania that we used to. Because we with family in Ohio, we constantly made the trips between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Rax is one of those things I kind of forgot existed until I saw it, and then I immediately remembered it.
So by the way, everybody, if you're still with us, the rabbit hole isn't the fact that we're like, hey, there's a fast food restaurant we used to go to.
No, it really has very little to do with Rax as much as this amazing, groundbreaking part of their history.
So towards the end of Rax's popularity, and in the midst of trying to reinvent themselves,
while they were flaming out,
they were on the way to losing most of their restaurants. They rebranded themselves with a cartoon character called Mr. Delicious.
Hello there. I'm Mr. Delicious, the new cartoon spokesman for Rax Restaurants. My job? To encourage you to enjoy tasty, affordable meals in a more mature dining environment. You see, Mr. Delicious doesn't appreciate unnecessary commotion while he's eating. It brings out the dangerous, hostile side in Mr. D. At least that's what his analyst says. Anyway, At Rax, Mr. Delicious can enjoy a tasty sandwich or salad without bright yellow formica upsetting his stomach. He can rest his feet on carpet, since Rax has confidence that Mr. D won't drop his twisty fries. He can lose himself in a cheap romance novel without his elbows sticking to the table. And Mr. Delicious always leaves Rax with a few bucks left. That's just grand, because his analyst charges a lot to keep Mr. D's hostility all locked up. So if you're looking for a stress-free fast food alternative, visit Rax and tell him Mr. Delicious sent you. Tickety-dee.
Rax, you can eat here.
Now, and this isn't just like some guy at Rax came up with this terrible idea. This was, they hired like one of the top ad agencies, I think in New York, to develop this game plan for this character, Mr. Delicious. And it was going to be like, this was supposed to be the thing that like saved Rax.
Yeah. And here's what's funny about Mr. Delicious is he's basically, from what I gather, if I'm remembering it correctly, a black and white kind of 2D cartoon character. So he's not like animated with a lot of nuance. He just kind of like, he kind of walks and shuffles. And
I like picture a guy like with you know, like thick, you know, glasses and like a plaid jacket. He looks like an animated character who would be selling cigarettes in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. So we're being nostalgic about Rax and this restaurant that we knew growing up, but the ad campaign itself was bizarrely nostalgic. It was like, so this ad firm had this idea of a very retro version of a patron to their restaurant, this man, Mr. Delicious. And here's what's so funny and just bizarrely strange about him was Rax was turning away from being a family restaurant
to being an adult restaurant.
Yeah. So Mr. Delicious doesn't want to go eat with his grubby kids. He doesn't want to feel like, oh, I don't want to go to this stupid place where the kids' playland is and there's Happy Meals. I want to go to a distinguished, refined adult fast food restaurant where I can get my roast beef sandwich for 99 cents.
Hello, I'm Mr. Delicious, the new spokesman for Rax Restaurants. My job? To encourage you to enjoy tasty, affordable meals in a more mature dining environment. I know what you're thinking. He's a cartoon. And cartoons are mostly for people who wet their pants. But not Mr. D. He's a special cartoon for adults. And Mr. Delicious always carries this briefcase. Contents? Watch for me and visit Rax. Tickety-dee.
And the commercials are these like, they're almost like lamentations, like of Mr. Delicious just talking about how terrible his life is. And it's like,
yes.
It's like you talk about Cheers, you know, the Cheers theme song. If you listen to the Cheers theme song, it's the song is basically about how mundane life is, but sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Rax is like the light at the end of the tunnel for Mr. Delicious's miserable existence.
Well, hello, Mr. D again. Our subject, Value Express combos at the Rax drive-thru. These tasty delights are priced in low, even dollar amounts, so there's no change. That's just grand, because Mr. Delicious just had some rather delicate surgery. If there's no change, he doesn't have to squirm so much to put it back in his pocket, now does he? He just grabs his combo and drives ever so slowly over the speed bump. Tickety-dee.
So these commercials are so strange because, yes, they always loop back around to my life is kind of horrible. I almost don't know if I can wake up tomorrow, but at least I can go to Rax. And in the midst of it, the commercials are basically saying, hey, everybody, don't bring your kids to our restaurant anymore.
Well, hello. Remember me? I'm Mr. Delicious. Did you know the Rax Value menu features a full array of adult-sized delectables for only 99 cents each? That's right. And Mr. Delicious can really appreciate a bargain like that. After all, he's still trying to recover from that bout with midlife crisis in '89. Fortunately, he was able to sell the Porsche back to the dealer. But much to his chagrin, Mr. Delicious discovered that custom-designed hair weaves are non-refundable. Same for the rotating disco glitter ball he installed in the basement. And that vacation he took to Bora Bora with those two young friends, well, that left Mr. Delicious feeling empty and unfulfilled. Unlike the robust sandwiches, baked potatoes, and refreshing drinks on the Rax Value menu for only 99 cents each. Tickety-dee,
Value menu available at participating restaurants. Rex, you can eat here.
So this is our rabbit hole. We want to invite you into this, discover the glorious, bizarre world of Mr. Delicious and how it was this amazing failure for Rax. But here's what we want to say. We might have a future episode on Mr. Delicious, and
we're not done with him.
Yeah, we hope to have a future with Mr. Delicious. We hope that he actually becomes part of our lives.
When I first heard Mr. Delicious, I went on a solid 3-day rabbit hole of just watching these commercials over and over. And to me, this is the most fascinating character. And the tragedy of Mr. Delicious is that Rax financially crumbled just 3 months after this campaign was, released. Because you could argue that he was the nail in their coffin. I don't think so.
He's the ET video game. Remember the ET video game? Like they made billions of them and they just buried him in a landfill.
Alamogordo, New Mexico.
He's the ET video game of the fast food world.
We went to there was a place in Daytona, Florida called the Daytona Video Game Museum or something like that. It was this retro video game museum, and they had purchased like tons of these previously buried copies of ET and all these Atari games, and they had them on display there. So we saw some of those.
That's cool.
They all looked like they had like dirt still on the boxes.
That's funny.
And that's exactly really what Mr. Delicious, he's come to be seen over time as this terrible mistake. Mm-hmm. And I want to redeem that because I think that it's unfair. I think Mr. Delicious was ahead of his time.
Yeah. So here's what we'd like to say. We have a bizarre sense of humor. We'd like to try to find a way to bring Mr. Delicious back. And we don't know what that means for us here in this podcast. The podcast itself is an experiment, all these episodes that we want to do. But Rax, if you're out there, do you want to sponsor a little fledgling podcast on nostalgia, on pop culture? Could Mr. Delicious be a fit for you again, Rax? Maybe Mr. Delicious could be what revives Rax and brings Rax back into being a prominent fast food establishment.
Absolutely, because what I want to see happen, what I want to do for Rax, and hear me out, we want to make Rax that last blockbuster. That last blockbuster that like people travel all over the country to go to, that one blockbuster video store that's still standing. I want people to drive thousands of miles to go to Rax,
and then they can buy their Mr. Delicious.
And there should be a
coffee mugs,
standee of Mr. Delicious greeting them at the door. There should be merchant T-shirts, tickety D, right on the tickety D. Mr. Delicious is retro cool.
And we have ideas for other characters too. There needs to be a Mrs. Delicious and the son. I don't know what his name is. Maybe Randy Delicious. I don't know. That just sounds funny to me. Randy Delicious, and is he a brat? But you know what?
They were just starting to build this incredible universe of Mr. Delicious, and we only got glimpses. We know about his vasectomy. We know that he suffered a midlife crisis that sent him to Bora Bora with two young friends. We know he was in therapy. We know he had an ex-wife at some point. So Mrs. Delicious isn't even the first Mrs. Delicious.
There's a lot there to unpack.
There really is.
Okay.
Plus, he did like to spend nights at the Rusty Anchor.
Yeah. we all know where that leads. Now, Joe, this was our origin story episode. Where are we going to take things for our first proper episode? What do you think?
For our first proper episode, well, it's all about timing. There's a new movie out. Have you heard about that?
Yeah. Do people go to see movies anymore in the theaters? I think some do. There's actually, there's one out, and it is actually, here's what's funny. When these new tent post, Marvel and DC movies, Star Wars movies comes out, people don't understand that every time they do it, they're actually playing off of people's nostalgia. And guess what? There's a new iteration of Batman, and that's coming out, and people think, oh, it's a new one. They're remaking him. Well, every time they remake Batman, they're also hearkening back to the older versions of him. And how does the new Batman play into our older conceptions of him? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look back into, well, one of the oldest conceptions of Batman.
Not the first, but the most legendary.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking about the Adam West, the 1966 Batman, which I absolutely grew up watching. What about you, Chris?
I didn't get a chance to see the TV show until later, and so I've never really dove deep into it. However, at my local library, they had on VHS, there was 2 Batman movies, right?
There was one movie.
Movie.
They did a couple 3-part episodes.
Okay.
That were like longer episodes because they were because Batman the series it was usually 2 episodes and same bat time, same bat place. There were a couple 3-parters. Then in the last season they went to like more just shorter half-hour episodes mostly.
Yeah.
But there was only one feature film.
Yeah,
which was like the big one with all the villains, the main villains.
Well, then that's what I watched, and I rented it, probably 4 times over the course of a few years. I'd always get that one, and I just always remember, like, was it the United Nations? They all turned into pillars of salt. Isn't that what it was?
Like multicolored, they're like pink and blue, and green,
and Batman just goes in. There's like
they get dehydrated, is what it was. Yeah.
So we're gonna dive deep into the 1960s Batman, but also how towards the end of his life, Adam West filmed or recorded some animated films that harkened back to those old days. And I'm going to be diving deep into those because I want to see how they are both an homage and a spoof of what they did back in the 60s. And, Batman is often known as the edgy Batman, but we're kind of interested in this campy Batman. And that's what our first proper episode is going to be about.
I think he used to call himself the Light Knight.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoy listening to these episodes. We are the Nostalgic Future Podcast, and we will see you next time on our next episode.
Same bat channel.
Thanks for listening to the Nostalgic Future Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at nostalgicfuturepodcast@gmail.com. We may just read your letter on an upcoming show. Follow us on social media, Nostalgic Future Podcast on Facebook and @PastFuturePod on Twitter. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave a review to help support what we do. Until next time, remember, the past is the only way forward.
I guess you could say I hired Mr. Delicious. It really started when we were looking for an advertising agency. I looked at over 50 agencies, and there was one that stood head and shoulders above all the others, and that was Deutsch in New York, a relatively young but very, very creative agency who, in my opinion, is producing the best advertising in the United States today. And through their process, which was a very detailed, analytical, as well as qualitative process by visiting stores, talking to managers, talking to employees, and spending a lot of time trying to understand the positioning of racks. And out of that positioning came the development through their creative process of Mr. Delicious, who was absolutely going to go down as one of the classic characters in advertising history.